You are listening to A Fright at Midnight. Tonight's tale is titled The Doll. I was quite taken aback when I received a message from Arthur, an old acquaintance of mine who I had not seen for several years, asking that I attend his address as a matter of urgency. We'd not spoken for a long while, not because of any malice between us, but rather we'd lost touch after he left the club. I always remembered him to be an affable fellow who would often throw lavish suppers at his home, of which I was grateful to have attended a good few. "Professor, thank you for coming." He had the look of a man in distress, smart but dishevelled, almost like the morning after a splendid night out. He'd aged since I last saw him, his thick black hair now thinner and speckled with grey. Where he was once clean-shaven, he now had an unkempt beard. "I understand that me contacting you after all of these years, quite puzzling, but I assure you your time is not wasted, and I'm more grateful than you can imagine that you've come." "Of course. I came as soon as you sent for me. What's this about, Arthur?" He fumbled for a cigarette, barely able to keep his hand steady to strike the match. Momentarily the flame illuminated his face. I could see the look of fear upon him. "It's in there," he said, motioning with his head towards the dining room. "What is?" I said, still puzzled. She is in there." "Oh, really, Arthur, you must give me a semblance of circumstance." "Please, just go and see." I took 2 steps towards the room before Arthur forcibly took my arm, momentarily stopping me moving forward. "I'm not mad, you know," he said, before gently releasing me. I entered the room to see, on the middle of the table, a child's doll. Was this what Arthur was talking about? I approached the table to examine it more closely. The doll was around 1 foot in height and wore a long laced christening gown, which spread out on the table under it. A slightly worn ceramic face was masked with a head of quite beautiful golden locks that descended into ringlets. It certainly looked like it had been made with care and a good level of artistry, but not being too educated on such matters, it was difficult to tell if this was of the highest quality. A number of stains on the dress and markings on the arm suggested that it had been well loved over the years. I leant in to get a closer look at its face. The features were certainly well cut and quite lifelike. "What do you think?" I turned to see Arthur at the door. I pointed at it and instinctively put my hand out to pick it up. "Don't touch it!" He caused me to jump back. "What the bloody hell is the matter with you, Arthur? It's a damned child's toy!" "I'm sorry. Look, let's speak in the other room. I could do with a brandy." Admittedly, after the last few moments, I could do with one myself, and followed Arthur into the living room where he poured our drinks. It was barely noticeable at first. I'd come down and see that she was in a very slightly changed position from how I'd left her the night before. Where her arms were down by her side, I'd find one raised, as if pointing at something. Of course I doubted myself. Perhaps it was some fault of the joint, or my mind playing tricks. Then it became far more real. I'd be upstairs and I could hear her moving, scratching and shuffling at first. But then, discernible footsteps. Not of an adult. Different. I sat outside of the room. I listened for hours. I would rush in to catch her. But nothing. I never saw her move. But her position changed. Even after a few moments, she could be a good several feet from where I'd originally placed her. I decided no more. I collected her up and placed her onto the fireplace. I had the match struck in my hand when it happened. "Oh, poor papa. Oh, poor papa." can hear the words now. It's Italian. It means, I'm scared, Daddy. It came from her. I took her from the fireplace and placed her into the cupboard. I ran upstairs. I went to the library. I remember I had an old book on Italian folk tales. Arthur produced a rather old dusty book and placed it in front of me. There, in black and white, was a doll not dissimilar to the one sat only a few feet from me moments before. He read from the book. Alle morte del bambino vera realizzata una bambola de cara e il bambino vivra di nuovo. Please, my poor pronunciation, but in English it means, on the death of the infant, a doll will be made and the child will live again. They call it Tombala Bombale, the grave baby. That night, the screaming started. All night she called for me. It went into the coming days, refusing to be on her own. She was only comforted when in my arms or near to me. But she's silent now, I said. She often is when others are near. Arthur, you're not well. This is madness. You need a doctor. I'll speak to Hugo, Professor de Bont. He's an expert on ailments of the mind. I'll persuade him to see you. I knew you wouldn't understand. Look, it's not your fault. I know. I can barely believe it myself. I gathered my belongings, my hat and scarf, and wished Arthur well. I was about to walk out of the door when I felt a need to get one more look at the doll. I stepped into the dining room, and there it was, sat in the middle of the table, unmoved from when I had observed it 20 minutes previously. Preposterous, I muttered to myself. I turned to leave, taking a step towards the open door. That's when it happened. A clear whisper. Dove, Papa? I froze on the spot. As clear as I have ever heard a single word muttered in my life. Even I knew, with my fleeting knowledge of Italian, that the words Dove, Papa meant, where's Daddy? I turned, not knowing what to expect, but there the doll sat, not moving, the ceramic face and glass eyes staring vacantly in the same direction as I walked in. Not saying a word, I left. Sleep evaded me that night, and I'm not ashamed to say that what little sleep I got was in the light of the lamp. I contacted Professor de Bont, who agreed to call on Arthur at the weekend, although I deliberately omitted what I had heard. I headed to Arthur's, both to tell him the news and to see her one more time. I knocked loudly on the door. I'm afraid you've missed him. The caretaker for the neighbouring property had come out. Left all of a rush this morning, I'm afraid, Governor. Said he was going back to where it started, whatever that means. I thanked the caretaker and asked if he knew when Arthur was returning. He replied he didn't. I started walking back to my carriage. Won't be missed in all fairness, sir. This last week, all that crashing and banging, and that child screaming and shouting from dusk till dawn. Papa, 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 honestly. Anyway, good day to you, sir. Good day, I replied. You've been listening to A Fright at Midnight. And that story was The Doll.